Member from Halton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Today we are debating the motion, the budget motion, and the budget motion reads that this House approves, in general, the budgetary policies of this government. Very simple motion. And of course, being a Conservative, it would be expected, perhaps, that I would say that I don't agree with this motion. But let's not start there. Let's look at what the budgetary policy of this government has been and where it has got us as far as a province in Ontario. And perhaps we can start by looking at the revenue numbers that this government has generated out of the taxpayers of Ontario. Now, the taxpayers of Ontario are a hardy lot. We are a wealthy province, and therefore the people who make up our province are wealthy, and they have deep pockets by and large. The average person in Ontario lives at a very high standard of living when judged against those people living around the world. We probably live in the 95th or better, 95% of the percentile of the world's population. So Ontarians, by and large, even those amongst us who don't feel as though they're rich, in measured against the world population, they are very well off. Therefore, they have deep pockets. Now, what this government has done since its election in 2003, it has increased the revenue that it generates through taxes by almost 60%. That's at a time when the economy of this province has grown just around 10%. So the economy of the province grew 10%, and the government extracted a 60% increase in taxes over that same period, far and away above the growth in the economy. And perhaps that's something that we should look at as to whether that's a policy. You know, if we go back and look at the Liberal government, for instance, of David Peterson, was first elected in 1995, and he served until the year 1990. Now, what happened? What was the budgetary policy of that government? Well, the last budget that Larry Grossman brought into this province in the spring of 1990 was for $24.4, I believe, billion was the total budget that Larry Grossman brought in. Now, the last budget that Bob Nixon brought in under the Peterson government was in the spring of 1990, and that budget was for $48.79, I believe, billion dollars, from $24 billion to $48 billion over a course of 5 years. So the Peterson government doubled the tax revenue of this government, taking that money out of the pockets of Ontarians. So that was a tax policy that the Liberals, David Peterson had, was to take every single penny out of the pockets of Ontario taxpayers that it thought it could get away with. And it effectively doubled the taxes over his term of office. Now, the third party came into power in September 6th of 1990, and they inherited a budget of $48.75 billion. But taxes had been risen so high that they had little room to increase income taxes. They had little room to increase fees. Basically, the only room the NDP were left with after 5 freewheeling years of Liberal government, including a horrendous health tax in 1989, which at that point increased taxes about $2.5 billion. At that point in time, it was the largest tax increase in Ontario's history. But the NDP took office, and the only avenue they had to increase spending, which they took, was to go into deficit financing. So at the end of 4.5 years, 1995, the last budget that Bob Rae's Liberals brought in was about $57 billion. $57 billion from $48 billion, that's what, a 10% increase? No, it's more than that. It's about 18% increase. About an 18% increase in provincial revenues. But, you know, Bob Rae was a piker on tax increases, even though the NDP are straddled with the opinion of the general public that they are freewheeling, free spending. But they only increased taxes 18% in the province of Ontario, where David Peterson increased them a full 100%. Now along came a chap by the name of Mike Harris and inherited a provincial budget of $57 billion. And over the next 8 years, that budget increased to $68 billion. $68 billion over 8 years. That was a 9% increase, hardly, just a little over 1% a year in increased tax revenues to the province, which I would argue the province was well run from a fiscal point of view. And then the government of Dalton McGuinty took over. He inherited a $68 billion budget and has increased that spending by a full 60%. So it seems to me that over the last 4 governments that this province has had, the Liberals increased 100%, the NDP increased by 18%, the Conservatives increased by 9%, and the current Liberal government by 60%. You can see a trend. And when you see a trend, it really represents a policy. So what is the budget policy of this government? It hasn't changed much from the Peterson days. The policy is to extract every penny that it thinks it can from the taxpayer's pocket. There are those who have said that the take-home pay of working Ontarians is really just unused tax room. We can increase taxes by the amount that these people, hard-working Ontarians, take home. That's part of the Laffer curve philosophy, that if you tax people by 100%, you will get 0 revenue. Likewise, if you tax them 0%, you will also get 0 revenue. Somewhere between taxing them not at all and taxing them to a maximum, somewhere in between those 2 points is the most efficient level of taxation, something that this government has gone far beyond. If we look at some of the other numbers in the budget documents, we'll see that that government expenses has increased significantly along the same level as revenues have, is something you would expect, although expenses have gone up more than revenue, which is why we have a deficit. And let's examine the deficit for a while. The deficit has risen first to $24 billion and then through some voodoo, which I'll speak to later, came down to $19 billion, and then now it's dropped to $16 billion for the next fiscal year. That a reducing deficit is a good thing. However, any deficit at all has an immoral side to it. A deficit is when you borrow money from future generations of Ontario taxpayers. Now, I've sat in this House for almost 16 years now, and I've never seen a bill go through that gives us permission to take money from future taxpayers. I've never heard from future taxpayers that they think it's okay for us to use their money. Now, in any other part of society, when you take money without permission, you take money from future taxpayers, or you take money from anyone in our society without their permission, it's called stealing. And you as a government, we as legislators, are taking money from future generations without their permission. And I think that this government should give very serious consideration as to what they are doing and why. You are spending far beyond your means, and you're doing it on the backs of future taxpayers. Personally, I believe there's an immoral aspect to what you're doing. If we look at the total debt that has been accruing over the course of Ontario's history, by 2003, the total debt got to be about $148 billion. Over the course of Confederation, since 1867, we've accumulated $148 billion in taxes. Now, this government, in 8 years, is on line to double that debt. Doubling that debt to almost $300 billion. In fact, by 2012, if there isn't a miracle on the balancing of the budget, which this government doesn't seem to be making an effort towards, if there isn't that miracle and a balanced budget, we will in fact have doubled the debt in the 8.5 years that this government has been in place. That is a legacy that should concern everyone in this House and should be felt deeply by every member of the government. It's an irresponsible expenditure, it's an irresponsible handling of taxpayers' dollars, it's a squandering of our future. If it wasn't for low interest rates, the consequences of that would be horrendous. I personally believe that interest rates over the next 5 to 7 years are going to return to somewhere around the normal of 6%. It's about 3 times what you're spending now. Now we're spending $10 billion a year in interest to service that debt. 5 to 7 years from now, that could be $30 billion. Imagine what you could do if you didn't have to service a debt with $30 billion, or even for $10 billion. You could probably build 10 hospitals a year, 250-bed hospitals. They probably run somewhere in the order of $800 million each. We could build new universities, we could build new roads, we could build all the things that Ontarians want if we weren't servicing that debt, a debt that this government has doubled. I think you want to have a serious talk to yourselves about what your legacy is, the legacy that you're leaving this House with. I, for one, think it will be remembered by the people of Ontario for a long time to come. Because it's not only this government that did it, David Peterson did it as well. He doubled the... Well, I just reviewed the numbers. The opposition, for those people at home, the opposition just woke up. They're telling me that Mike Harris added to these figures. As I said in my comments, Mike Harris increased the spending of this government 9% over 8 years. 9%, not 100%, 9%. At a time when the economy was expanding. In those years, we expanded the economy somewhere between 16 and 20%. So the tax revenues grew half of what the economy expanded. What has this government done? This government, when the economy has expanded around 10% over the 8 years of your governance, you have expanded government revenues by 73%. Entirely different ratio. One is sustainable. One is growth-oriented. The other is leading to disaster. It has led us into have-not status. And of course, we're getting about $2.5 billion from have-not status this year. Our welfare payment from the rest of Canada is 2.5 billion. Now the Liberals, this Liberal government of Dalton McGuinty, has a fancy formula, and they say we pay $5 million in and we get $2.5 million out. We're still paying for our own deficit. That's I don't think I can use that language as to what I feel about that kind of thinking. I don't believe it's parliamentary. But if you figure quickly and you don't give it much thought, those numbers will work. But if you do give it any thought, if you do give it some consideration and see what would happen down the road if you extrapolate those numbers, you will find out that Ontario will get weaker and weaker and weaker every year that we continue to be a have-not province. And that's a shame for the economic engine of Canada to be in that situation. And it's in that situation because almost every industry that drove this great province has had an incursion with this government. It's had its problems. The forest industry, which Northern Ontario lives by and has tremendous bonuses and attributes to Southern Ontario. It's an industry that truly supports all of this great province. And they've been decimated in the north. We've heard about it in debate. The NDP have been warning the government about the consequences. Many of their members come from the north, and they're fully aware of the consequences of what's happening in the north. When electrical prices increase in the pulp and paper business, they're big users of electricity. The problems are horrendous, and mills close. 30, 40, 60, 80 mills in Northern Ontario have closed. Yes, they have closed in other provinces as well, and a lot of it is because of the Canadian dollar. But there are many places that are doing much better than Ontario because they've controlled their costs, those costs that are controlled by the government, by this government. Hydro costs, for instance, cost of transportation, fees, stumpage fees, all kinds of expenses, all kinds of costs of doing business in Ontario, and all of those costs have increased. This government can't point to one cost in Ontario, not one cost in Ontario, that has gone down under their term of government. And as a legacy of 8 years in government, that's a very sad legacy. It's unfortunate that the economic engine of Canada has fallen on such hard times. There have been, in this budget, of course, there's been a number of reallocations of funds, things that will make the balance ledger look a little better. Things like that they've reduced their original budget projections from $19.7 billion down to $16.7. Things like the elimination of a $700 million planned reserve fund. We've always had a reserve fund in the Ontario budget, and by eliminating that $700 million, it reduces what the deficit looks like. It didn't reduce the deficit one penny, but it reduces what it looks like. It's a visual, a straight visual. It doesn't have any effect on the government of Ontario or their net results. So I'm saddened by this budget motion. I can't support this budget motion because of what it does to Ontario. And it seems to me the budget motion talks about the principles of finance, and the principles of finance that have been put forward by every Liberal government this province has had since the Second World War, in modern times, every single one has increased the amount of taxes, increased deficits,